So, this lecture is going to be a continuation of the conversation that we started having about fossil fuels and specifically oil, and we're going to be talking about oil spills as environmental disasters. Sorry, um, and we're specifically going to talk about two pretty notorious oil spills in American history: the Exxon Valdez and the Deepwater Horizon. Exxon Valdez, of course, was in the 80s. Deepwater Horizon was about a decade ago now. So we're going to talk about these, sort of the content of these two disasters, and then contextualize them with Chernobyl, actually, and this larger commentary on what is an environmental disaster, what is a natural disaster, and also how climate change really is this aggregate of every possible natural disaster, as well as being a natural disaster in its own right. So let's start with the Exxon Valdez. So the Exxon Valdez was an oil tanker that left port from Valdez, Alaska, and ran aground very shortly after on a reef, spilling its oil all through Prince William Sound, down even into the Cook Inlet, which all occupy places around the rim of the larger Gulf of Alaska down here. So just some context, some geographical context. Here's Alaska. Most of the oil is oil wells and gas wells are located up here on the north slope of Alaska in the National Petroleum Reserve and along the north slope. You'll notice that these are directly up against the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, where drilling is not allowed, but it's controversial politically because, or I mean, like the right has made it controversial because they want to drill there, because very clearly there is going to be oil there, noting its proximity to the NPR. So all of that oil that's drilled and extracted in the NPR and in the North Slope is sent down to Valdez through the Alaskan pipeline, which begins at Prudhoe Bay in the north on the Arctic Ocean and ends at Valdez on the Gulf of Alaska, Prince William Sound. So this is the long Alaskan pipeline, which runs through Fairbanks and is the site of many controversial political conversations, protests, all sorts of things. So the Exxon Valdez on March 24th, 1989, I mentioned, ran aground at a reef just barely south of Valdez. So let's situate ourselves. Here's the state of Alaska. Zooming in on this area here, you have the city of Valdez. You have Anchorage here, large city in Alaska. You have Prince William Sound, the Gulf of Alaska, the Cook Inlet here, Shelikof Strait, etc. Okay, so the ship, the Exxon Valdez, left Valdez, came out through this narrow inlet here, and then in an attempt to avoid icebergs, glacial ice, coming off some glaciers out of the Chugach National Forest, started to move southward. Unfortunately, it went out of the path that ships are supposed to take out of Valdez, and it ran aground on a reef. And then you can see that it spilled oil all through Prince William Sound, down along the Kenai Fords, all the way into the Shelikof Strait and Kodiak National Wildlife Refuge. So damaging all of this shoreline, polluting all of this ocean with oil. The cleanup was botched. Everything that could have gone wrong went wrong. And supposedly, the Exxon Valdez spurred a number of regulations and rules changes regarding oil tankers. But we'll talk about that, how effective they were and whether they did anything at all and still matter. So, but this is just the history of the event itself. Here's an aerial shot of the Exxon Valdez and the rescue tanker removing the oil from the Exxon Valdez. You can see the slick itself here in Prince William Sound. was extensive and traveled very far for just one tiny oil tanker. Okay, and we'll talk about that in comparison with like the Deepwater Horizon, which was a huge oil platform in the Gulf of Mexico. All right, so what happened after the Exxon Valdez? I've got a video here which I want to show. So if I pull up this video, I'm just gonna play this New York Times video now about the Exxon Valdez.
An oil tanker ran aground today off the nation's northernmost ice-free port, Valdez, Alaska.
One of the worst oil spills in U.S. history brought Americans images of blackened beaches, dying wildlife, outrage, and betrayal.
The evidence is that the response was slow and inadequate.
Blame soon centered on the tanker captain.
It is now clear that the captain of the tanker, who was not on the bridge at the time of the accident, had been drinking.
But the accident also exposed the inattention to oil industry safety and led to promises to repair the damage that had been done.
We will consider whatever it takes to keep you whole.
And to do more to stop future spills.
We also rededicate ourselves to transportation safety and to realistic planning for accidents that do occur.
Nearly 25 years later, what happened to the promises made in the wake of the Exxon Valdez?
The Gulf spill might already be as much as 3 times worse than the Exxon Valdez disaster.
Just past midnight on March 24th, the supertanker Exxon Valdez crashed into a reef off the coast of southern Alaska.
One of America's most magnificent waterways is blackened and befouled tonight by the biggest oil spill in American history.
240,000 barrels, 11 million gallons of Alaskan crude oil escaped from the huge vessel.
The oil industry's response plans had promised a swift cleanup in the event of a spill. But Ricky Ott was alarmed when she flew over the wreck.
We're 9 hours after the wreck, and there was not a speck of promised recovery equipment on the water. This had all been promised within 6 hours, and we were 3 hours past 6 hours, and nothing.
Neither Exxon nor Alyeska, the oil pipeline company in charge of the immediate response, was ready for such a large spill.
Alyeska was supposed to have an emergency response team at its terminal in Valdez, but 8 years ago the team was disbanded.
The response vessels were either under snow or being repaired. They were completely overwhelmed. Coast Guard didn't quite know what to do.
Equipment to fight this spill has to be flown in from as far away as Texas and England.
Exxon says it's using all available resources, but it argues the spill is simply too big to surround with booms and skim it up.
As images of the spill appeared on the evening news, Exxon began limited tests of chemical dispersants to try to break up the oil. The dispersants were controversial, and it was unclear if they would work or cause even more harm.
The chemicals that you use to cause the oil to sink is very dangerous to marine life, and we have to be certain that we cause a minimal amount of damage.
But it was soon too late to matter.
Winds up to 70 miles an hour virtually shut down the oil spill cleanup operation this morning.
The storm had come up and the oil was moving, and almost nothing could be done.
Some crews are literally on their knees using absorbent towels to remove the oil from rocky beaches.
Less than 15% of the oil was recovered. News cameras captured the damage.
800 miles of shoreline already covered with oil.
And the anger.
This should have been the easiest spill in the world to clean up.
Growing questions about how future disasters of this kind can be prevented, and why there was such a slow response to this spill.
At the same time, another storyline was also taking hold.
The Exxon spokesperson says there might have been a problem with Captain Hazelwood. It seems he had a bit of a drinking problem.
Good evening. The captain was drinking. The captain has been fired. That is the sum of it from Alaska tonight.
The story became Hazelwood.
Top 10 excuses of the Exxon tanker captain. Number 10 was trying to scrape ice off reef for margarita.
That's a sensational kind of story. You have an immediate assignment of responsibility, an immediate villain. What was lost in all of that was the company's responsibility.
When a pipeline to bring oil from northern Alaska to Valdez was approved in 1973, the oil industry and the federal government promised to make safety a priority.
The Alaska pipeline's on its way. The environment will be saved.
The government initially supported double-hulled tankers and a high-tech navigation system in Valdez.
We were given blanket assurances about safety and spills. In retrospect, I erred in not making sure that what was said was not put in writing.
Those promises never materialized, and when the state of Alaska passed its own safety law, the oil industry sued, saying the law infringed on federal authority.
The court threw out the state's plan, so no double-hulled tankers, much more freedom to determine where the navigation channel would be.
When the pipeline first opened, tankers were closely monitored by the Coast Guard and stayed in the shipping lanes even when they were clogged with ice flows.
Instead of diverting out of the channel, they were supposed to slow down.
But by the time the Exxon Valdez left port, the Coast Guard routinely allowed ships to leave the channel to avoid the increasing amount of ice.
Slowing down was not something they want to do because time is money.
Judging by our radar, I will probably divert from the TSS and end up in inbound lane if there's no conflicting traffic. Over.
A few minutes after that message, the Coast Guard wasn't monitoring the Valdez on its radar.
The Coast Guard is supposed to be the check in case the ship makes a mistake, and they weren't watching the ship.
Captain Hazelwood turned the bridge over to third mate Gregory Cousins and went to his quarters, after giving instructions to maneuver around the ice.
Did you have any concerns about getting past the ice?
Not at that time, not at that instant.
Cousins continued going south, heading directly into Bly Reef.
A federal investigation later found that Cousins lost track of the ship's location and didn't turn back in time. It found that reduced tanker crews probably left Cousins overworked and tired, contributing to the accident, a conclusion Cousins and Exxon disputed. The investigation faulted Hazelwood for leaving the bridge and said his judgment was impaired by alcohol. Hazelwood denied he was drunk and was later acquitted of criminal charges related to drinking.
Did they have some fault? Yes. But the real fault was there wasn't the safety net.
Exxon spent more than $2 billion cleaning up the spill and says there was no long-term environmental damage. But pockets of oil remain beneath the surface of some beaches more than 2 decades later.
Prince William Sound is not the same as it was. The environment still has not fully recovered, and we're over 2 decades into this now.
Exxon paid $300 million to those hurt by the spill, and a jury later awarded another $5 billion in punitive damages. Exxon appealed, delaying the case for 14 years and leaving lasting bitterness in Alaska.
4,000 of the original plaintiffs have died since the Exxon Valdez.
In 2008, the Supreme Court cut punitive damages to 1/10 of the original amount.
The community is still very depressed.
Fishermen like Mike Weber say the local economy never recovered.
500 people left. That's a lot in a small community. I'll never recover from the oil spill.
After the spill, Exxon became an industry leader in safety, and millions of federal dollars were designated for cleanup research. Congress required better contingency planning, double-hull tankers, and tugboat escorts in Prince William Sound.
We were now making traffic out of Valdez probably the safest line of passage anywhere in the globe.
The explosion happened at the Deepwater Horizon rig Tuesday night.
Now everyone's hoping and praying that the Gulf of Mexico rig doesn't turn into an environmental disaster.
We're going to fight it subsea, on the surface, and on the shore.
After the BP oil spill, a presidential commission found that many lessons of the Exxon Valdez had been forgotten in the pursuit of offshore oil drilling.
I used the phrase that the offense got way ahead of the defense. The potential risks had increased dramatically, but there had been no commensurate increase in our capability to avoid an accident or to respond to it.
It found that the major oil companies had made only a minimal investment in new response technology, and the government spent less than half the authorized amount on cleanup research.
The emphasis is always on preventing these things from occurring, because when they happen, we're not very well equipped to deal with them.
The news was again filled with the struggle to contain a massive spill, using much of the same crude cleanup technology used 20 years earlier.
We're still relying on booms, still relying on skimmers, still relying on shovels.
And response plans that were again unrealistic.
Lawmakers are alarmed that BP's competitors have given the government nearly identical emergency response plans. Those plans include steps to protect wildlife that does not even live in the Gulf.
And the government authorized BP to use nearly 2 million gallons of dispersants, though many of the same questions were still unanswered.
The key question that scientists are trying to figure out is whether oil dispersants in the deep ocean do more harm than good.
The commission also found that while tanker safety improved after Valdez, the oil industry resisted new offshore drilling safety rules.
It was reflective of a culture in the offshore oil industry. We ended up 20 years after Exxon Valdez with an even more serious incident, but no better prepared to avoid it or deal with it.
The other oil companies, including Exxon, have denied that a systemic problem exists.
We would not have drilled the well the way they did.
3 years after the spill, new commitments have once again been made to improve spill prevention and response.
3 years out from Exxon Valdez, there was still a deep commitment to applying the lessons that had been learned. 10 years out, that commitment had substantially eroded. If you come back in the year 2020 and ask what have we learned, are we safer, I think we'll know whether we really learned the lesson of Exxon Valdez.
Okay, so a lot of things in there, and they do touch on the Deepwater Horizon, which is important because we are going to be comparing and contrasting the two, thinking about that. All right, so what happened specifically? Let's go over some specifics of what happened to the environment. Specifically, let's look at some of the species that were affected by the spill and their rate of recovery. So the species that have recovered, so the spill was in 1989, right? And here's a timeline through, this graph is through 2014. These are all the species that recovered and when. So even like the sea otters, right, which have recovered as of 2013, it took however many years, what is that, 24 years for that species to recover. So yes, that's a good thing, it recovered, but it took a long time, right? Some of these other species here, rockfish, cutthroat trout, loons, salmon, and river otters, bald eagles, right, which is an endangered species, took about a decade to recover in the region, in the Prince William Sound, Kenai Peninsula region. Some species and habitats that are still recovering as of 2014, and honestly probably still through today, include one of the killer whale pods from the Sound, the designated wilderness areas and the intertidal communities, as well as sediments, right? So the sediments like at the bottom of the Sound and other inlets are greatly affected by the oil, and there's actually still a lot of oil in those sediments, and we have a video on that as well. So some species and habitats that are not recovering and will probably never recover are one of the killer whale pods, and then a bird species and a herring, fish species. So the killer whale pod in particular is very sad. One of the ways in which oil spills can affect species is through their ability to reproduce. Killer whales, their pods are very tight-knit family units, so if the female members of that unit become infertile because of the oil spill, then the pod essentially dies out, and that's what we're seeing happening with that killer whale pod there. All right, so I've got a video. I've also got another video on the Exxon Valdez. Oh my gosh, on the species and such. So let me pull that up.
Did you know memory foam was developed in 1966? That's 10 years older than VHS. And what's crazier is...
Okay, so that wraps up the Exxon Valdez. So let's move then to the Deepwater Horizon. And then, as you'll remember from that New York Times video, the two are inextricably linked, especially with respect to the regulations governing oil spills. And I want you to, for this portion of this lecture, think about the regulations that were passed after Chernobyl, for example, and how basically nuclear power plant construction came to a halt, and what has happened after each subsequent oil spill. And I want you to think about and compare and contrast those two ideas. So the Deepwater Horizon, what was the Deepwater Horizon? So the Deepwater Horizon was a semi-submersible rig in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico. Semi-submersible means it was floating on top of the water, but it was also tied to the bottom using cables, and then, of course, the pipeline down the middle. And so originally these types of rigs were conceived as bottom-supported drilling units, but they eventually found their quote-unquote true calling. So now these semi-subs are the most stable of any of the floating rigs. So floating rigs are used in oil drilling for regions of the ocean that are too deep to build an entire rig that's kind of pillar to the ground. But these semi-subs are really good because they really quote-unquote good because they can withstand really rough waters. They're built in such a way that they're very, very floatable. So here's an image of the Deepwater Horizon before it exploded and sank. Let's see. Where is the Deepwater Horizon? The Deepwater Horizon is called as such because it is in deep water of the Gulf of Mexico. So off the coast of Louisiana and Texas, there's a continental shelf here where there's a lot of oil drilling going on. All of these dots represents an oil well. The color of the dot represents the year in which that oil well was dug. And the size of the dot represents how high above the floor of the ocean that well sits. So how deep the water is, essentially, right? So a lot of these wells are in relatively shallow water between 0 and 200, 500 to 1,000 feet, okay? Many of these were built in the 40s and 50s and 60s. As you become more recent in time, you can see that the more recent wells, and again, these are only through 2005 because we're talking about Deepwater Horizon, which was in 2010, but dug in 2001. These more recent wells are out here in very deep water. So, for example, the Deepwater Horizon itself, the well that it was sitting on top of, the well that was dug, was the Macondo well, and so the top of that well, right, which is on the floor of the ocean in the rock, was almost 5,000 feet below where the Deepwater Horizon rig was floating. And then the well itself extended another 5,000 or 18,000 feet into the rock to obtain the oil, okay? So the Macondo well is the actual well that's in the rock, and the Deepwater Horizon is the rig that was sitting on top of the Macondo well. So the Macondo well was dug in 2001, and the Deepwater Horizon rig was actually just testing to see whether this would be a viable well. The Deepwater Horizon exploded as it was transitioning from an exploratory rig, which is what it was called, an exploratory rig, exploring whether this well is productive, to a production rig, which would sit there for as long as this well could produce oil that could be sent off to be sold. So the Deepwater Horizon was an exploratory rig. It was not the permanent sort of production rig. That was what was going to come and replace it, but then of course it exploded and blew up the whole well. So what happened? You can watch this video, this YouTube video. It's very dry, but it does give you all of the details. There's also a movie that you can watch starring Mark Wahlberg called The Deepwater Horizon, and honestly it's fairly accurate and it's a decent movie. I've shown it in this course before. I'm not going to show it here, but if you do have a chance to watch it, I don't not recommend it. So here's what happened. Here's the well sitting on top of, or the rig sitting on top of the well. The blowout preventer, which is what ended up blowing, hadn't been inspected for 5 years. Okay, number one. 2, internal documents from British Petroleum, BP, which was the owner of the well, show that BP engineers had concerns as early as 2009, so a year before the Deepwater Horizon explosion, that the metal casing that BP wanted to use would collapse under high pressure. So they're going to case the well, right? And there's concerns that that casing is cheap, too cheap, won't withstand enough pressure. According to a number of workers on the rig, it was understood that workers could get fired for raising safety concerns that would delay drilling. And then here's the actual what happened. So many problems that were reported throughout March of 2010 were ignored because BP really wanted to get this well to production. So the explosion itself happened as they were capping the well. Okay, they're going to cap the well, move the rig off, and then move a new rig on, uncap the well, and then produce oil. It was during that capping that the well exploded. So there's all these problems. They're speeding through this because they really want to get to production. So the blowout preventer, again, this is a critical component part of this, was damaged in an accident that was never reported in late March. According to Transocean, which was the contractor that was maintaining the rig, workers had been performing standard routines and had no indication of any problems prior to the explosion. But they just went ahead with this. They went ahead with it anyway, despite all of these sort of concerns. So what are they doing? They're going to take the well. They're going to shove cement down into the casing of the well, cap it, and then move the rig off. And it's that cement casing and that cement cap that blew up. So an April memo, just very close to the actual explosion itself, warned that the cementing of the casing was unlikely to be successful. And the BP Vice President of Drilling himself, Patrick O'Brien, was literally on the platform 2 hours prior to the explosion to celebrate 7 years without an incident, and basically push for them to move forward with this capping process. So there are findings now after the fact that the internal investigation indicated that several serious warning signs were kept popping up in the hours before the blowout. But bottom line, bold print, BP appears to have chosen riskier procedures to save time and or money, most of the time against the advice of its staff or contractors. So they are really trying to rush this well to production. So here's what actually happened with the explosion. So a surge of natural gas blasted through this concrete core that had been installed by Halliburton, and essentially blew the top off of this well that they thought was capped. It blew all of this concrete mixture onto the deck of the rig, where it then ignited. Obviously, it's highly flammable natural gas and oil. It ignited, and the entire rig was engulfed in flames, and ultimately sank to the bottom of the ocean, leaving an unexposed wellhead. Okay, so there are kind of two parts to this story. So it's likely that the core that they tried to put into the well itself was too weak because it was composed of a concrete mixture that used nitrogen gas, a little bit of nitrogen gas, to accelerate the curing process, to accelerate how quickly it dried. Because again, BP, capitalist, evil capitalist BP, is trying to rush this rig to production. Oops. So, the blowout itself occurred at 10 p.m. on April 20th. It took 2 days for the Deepwater Horizon itself to sink. Okay, so the entire rig itself is on fire. Here's an image from that time of several Coast Guard ships trying to put out the fire. Took 2 days, and ultimately the rig itself sank for obvious reasons. 11 people died in this explosion and subsequent fire on the rig itself. So that's kind of like part one of the disaster. Part two is that now the rig falls off of this exposed wellhead, okay, and the oil that was being pressurized and pumped sort of out of the well underground through the Macondo well and was being sent up to the rig is now leaking into the Gulf of Mexico. On average, 340,000 gallons of crude oil per day after the rig itself capsized and fell off of the well. So the oil was leaking from, the other dangerous part of this is that the oil itself was leaking for months from the wellhead, which is at the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico, 5,000 feet below the surface. So it's not an oil spill on the surface, it's an oil spill at the deepest levels of the Gulf of Mexico, right, pretty much. And so that's important when we consider like where this oil is going to go and what is it going to affect. So here's an image showing where the oil itself was identified on the surface of the ocean of the Gulf of Mexico. So here's the well itself, the Deepwater Horizon Macondo well, and all of this maroonish red shows where the oil was observed on the surface of the Gulf of Mexico. Here's another image showing kind of the same thing, but also trying to integrate it over the whole volume of the Gulf of Mexico itself, to see how much oil is actually in the whole column of water, not just on the surface. So here's an image from an aircraft of what that oil slick looked like. So it wasn't just like a little bit of oil on the surface of the Gulf of Mexico. It was rivers and rivers of oil traveling for very, very far distances. You can see that the oil went all the way as far south as like sort of halfway between the tip of Florida and the tip of Cuba, down here. Okay, so very deep into the Gulf of Mexico. That's just what we could see. Obviously, the little droplets of oil can travel very far, much further than sort of what we see with our own eyes from space. So oil leaked into the Gulf of Mexico for more than 3 months. There were several attempts to cap the wellhead, but they were largely unsuccessful. Ultimately, what stopped it, is that they dug new wells next to the original well to relieve some of the pressure off of the original well because of this natural gas bubble that was existing down there in the oil well itself. So at the peak of the spill, 60,000 barrels of oil were leaking from the exposed wellhead. And over the course of the 3 months that the Macondo well was leaking, 5 million barrels of oil are estimated to have spilled into the Gulf. Only 800,000 of those were captured. For comparison, the Exxon Valdez, which we just were learning about, leaked to just 260,000 barrels. Compare that to 5 million barrels from the Deepwater Horizon, and the scale of these disasters is very different. Let me check out this link here. I believe there's a video in this link that I will show you. Yes, okay, so this is a great explainer, and I really love the animation of where did the oil go from the Deepwater Horizon oil spill.
Where did the oil go after one of the worst environmental disasters in U.S. history? It's been 5 years since the Deepwater Horizon drilling platform exploded, and scientists are still trying to figure out how badly the blowout damaged the Gulf.
That oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico is growing. Growing by about 5,000 barrels of oil every day.
This is the worst oil spill in U.S. history.
As much as 60,000 barrels of oil. That's more than 2.5 million gallons of oil day after day, week after week.
When the well was finally capped 87 days later, birds and turtles were covered in oil as the slick stretched toward the coast and the stench of benzene filled the air. It was like a bat signal, attracting excellent scientists from all across the country.
It's very difficult to do reputable, replicable science under crisis conditions.
When you're trying to answer the most basic questions about the BP disaster, like where did all the oil go, it helps to know what you're looking for. Scientists from the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution on Cape Cod were among the first on the scene. They brought a tool they had originally developed to collect gas at hydrothermal vents and used it to take chemical measurements at the wellhead. They were trying to understand what exactly was spewing into the water.
When people try to balance their checkbook, it's easy to account for known quantities, but if you can't see a line item, like oil at the bottom of the ocean floor or someplace else, it's difficult to balance the books for where it went and how much went where.
Above the surface, Tom Ryerson and his team did much the same thing. In a specially outfitted plane, they flew above the blowout, taking high-resolution chemical measurements.
We compared notes and found that their subsurface measurements showed all those compounds that were missing from the atmosphere. This was a really delightful example of teamwork, using measurements from a mile deep to a mile overhead to understand what went where and why.
Tracking the fate of known chemicals is one thing, but it can also be important to find things you weren't looking for. About a month into the disaster, BP began injecting dispersants into the deep water to try to break up the oil as it exited the wellhead. But there was no data about what happens when dispersants are injected deep underwater, because it hadn't been done before.
BP and EPA were on Capitol Hill saying the dispersant will degrade and go away. So when we found it, that was kind of a big deal. The dispersant was there and it wasn't being degraded.
You would hear the statement that oil wasn't on the surface of the water anymore, so it was gone. That's an astonishing conclusion to come to. We collected cores out in the Gulf for years and had never seen anything like the layers we saw in August and September of 2010. And we continue to see those same layers. They're not going anywhere. People assume that putting stuff on the bottom means no more harm, but the deepwater core communities have been hammered by the deposition of sedimented oil.
5 years is actually a short period of time in science, and researchers are still trying to fit the ecosystem-wide pieces together.
For example, there are still questions about the rates of recovery of salt marshes that were oiled during the spill.
At the same time, this is all happening in someone's backyard, where people live and work.
In today's world, it's not enough to be just a scientist. You have to be a science educator. And this is way beyond an oil spill. This oil spill made me see that I had the ability to possibly make the world a better place, and I'm going to do that with every ounce of my being.
April 20th, 2015 will be day 1,825 of the Deepwater Horizon disaster. The well is capped, but scientists say it might take a decade to even begin to understand the blowout's full impact, which hasn't ended just because the flow of oil has stopped. This is the kind of disaster that's bound to happen when we drill for oil at the bottom of the sea. So perhaps the most important question of all is, why do we keep doing it? That's not something the scientists I talk to can answer.
Okay, very obviously important questions. So let's talk a bit about what we know about the environmental impact, and obviously we're still learning things as the video showed. But let's talk about what we do know. So first of all, throughout the summer of 2010, they basically closed off the Gulf of Mexico for fishing. You can see within this red box here, or this red polygon, this was the area that was closed as of June 21st, 2010, and remained closed for a long time. This affected the fishing economy in the Gulf of Mexico and probably continues to affect the quality and quantity of fish that can be fished out of the Gulf of Mexico. Again, one of the major impacts of oil spill on species is reproduction. Here's a map on the left, which is very interesting. This shows where a model thinks particles of oil are 5 years after the spill. And you can see that they're not just in the Gulf of Mexico. They're across the Atlantic Ocean, all the way down to the southern tip of Africa, and all the way up to Europe. This is because those chemicals stick to the backs of sea turtles, those little oil particles. Sea turtles have large, long migrations across the Atlantic Ocean from sort of the southwest coast of Africa all the way to the Gulf of Mexico and back, stopping along the way along South America, Central America, and Northern Africa, right? So during this time, after 5 years, transporting lots of particles of oil out of the Gulf of Mexico. So this is really an entire Atlantic basin environmental disaster at this point in time. Here's where oil was observed along the shorelines and the marshes, and this shoreline of Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, like sort of near Pensacola and Tallahassee, and then also into Texas, is a very marshy bayou ecosystem. So these marshes are sort of in the ocean, but sort of not, and they actually are very important for maintaining the health of inland ecosystems because they buffer a lot of the disturbances coming off the Gulf of Mexico, thunderstorms, hurricanes, that sort of thing. Because of global warming, these shoreline marshes, these marshlands, the Louisiana Bayou, right, are disappearing at a rate of about 1 football field per day. Add to that the accumulated oil from the oil spill, and these marshes are disappearing at an accelerated rate now. And you can see where some of the heaviest buildup along the coast of sort of Louisiana, southern Louisiana, and southern Alabama, and far western Florida here. All right, some more studies we've got on this slide. So fate-oriented studies show that oil spread both in the deep waters and at the surface. This is expected because it was leaking out of the bottom, from the bottom of the ocean. Only a minor part of the released oil, so probably less than 15%, and maybe as low as 4%, made landfall along the coast, which means most of the oil that escaped from the Macondo well is still in the water and can't really be cleaned up off the beach or off the shoreline. This is partly due to the great depth of the blowout, the extensive use of oil dispersing agents, both at the wellhead and at the surface, and other response measures such as burning in situ, where they will burn the oil off the top, or a massive bloom of oil-degrading microbes, etc., and ocean currents. Effects-oriented studies demonstrate that the oil was very toxic to a wide range of organisms, including plankton, invertebrates, fish, birds, and seamounts, basically anything living in the Gulf of Mexico, causing a wide array of adverse effects such as reduced growth, disease, impaired reproduction, which we've been talking about, impaired physiological health, and mortality. And ecological resources in the northern Gulf of Mexico that were particularly impacted by this Deepwater Horizon spill include these deep ocean habitats, these deep sea coral reefs, also threatened by climate change, salt marsh ecosystems along the marshy coastline, and then many organisms like fish and shorebirds, which mate and lay their eggs and raise their young on these sargassum habitats and seagrass areas, which are now sort of gone and decimated because of the oil, and I have a video on that. So here are all the ways that an oil spill can affect the ecosystem. So you have the oil exposure, right? It can be exposed via many different routes: aspiration, breathing it, fouling through feces, inhalation, ingestion, and absorption. The ways in which it can harm ecosystems and organisms are through DNA damage, altered gene expression, cellular damage, oxidative stress, right? Which then leads to these indicators like hormonal imbalances, reproductive problems, liver enzymes, low blood sugar, lung damage, inflammation, hypothermia, edema, necrosis. Lots of different things can happen. This can cause developmental defects and cardiac disease, immune dysfunction, reproductive dysfunction, which can then affect the whole species through not just mortality, but also infection and reproductive failure, reduced fitness, growth inhibition, all these things. Okay, so it's really a longitudinal effect. It's not just something that happens right away and then goes away. It's longitudinal, and the effects change over time as well. Tourism was also impacted by the spill. So here is just a plain satellite kind of Google Earth image showing the incident site, and then all of the oil slicks. You can actually just see it from the sun reflection. The beaches were covered in oil. The coastline was covered in oil. This obviously affected not just the ecosystem and the species and the organisms living in that region, but also tourism and people who go to the beach. Specifically, one of the species that suffered a really large impact was birds, and I believe this video is worth showing. Oops. Actually, I'm gonna skip the video, but I'll post. It's in the slides. You can watch it. I kind of want to wrap this up. So, in the years following the spill, so there's also an effect on human health directly. So, in the years following the spill, an estimated 170,000 people worked in some capacity to clean the oil and tarred coastlines, and for many of these workers, some medical reports indicated headaches, shortness of breath, skin rashes, and chronic coughs. And a recent study found that people who worked on the spill had significantly altered blood profiles that put them at an increased risk of developing liver cancer, leukemia, and other disorders. Okay, this is very similar to the workers that were affected after the cleanup at Chernobyl, who were exposed to the radiation. So BP and other agencies knowingly put their cleanup crew workers in danger. And this is another thing to consider among the many to consider with this disaster. Comparing this to other large oil spills, by far the largest oil spill in the ocean. You can see here the Deepwater Horizon with 5 million barrels, the Exxon Valdez down here with about 250,000 barrels, and then a couple of large spills occupy the space in between those that were not in the U.S. So we talked about regulations, and we talked about how all of these regulations were put in after Exxon Valdez, and then when it came time to regulate during Deepwater Horizon, none of them really mattered. So they were kind of disregarded and didn't really make a lot of sense. So after Deepwater Horizon, the Obama administration put a bunch of new regulations into play regarding offshore drilling. Because a lot of the regulations after Exxon Valdez were specific to oil tankers and didn't really apply to offshore drilling. Lots of loopholes. So Obama administration created a bunch of new regulations, and then of course the Trump administration has eased those regulations, priming us for what is likely to be another disastrous oil spill from an offshore drilling rig. So cool. So I want to just leave us with this question. Deepwater Horizon and the Deepwater Horizon disaster has been characterized as America's Chernobyl. I want to know what you think about that. Okay. Can we compare and contrast the two? What were the responses to those disasters? How were they similar, and how were they very different? Is it fair to characterize the Deepwater Horizon as America's Chernobyl, or was it a lot worse? Okay, lots of things to consider. But that is the end of this lecture.